We're going to turn this morning again in God's Word to the book of Deuteronomy. And if you've been here over the course of the last month, you know that we've been looking at Deuteronomy, both to kind of look back at where God has been in the history of this church. And as we turn 65 in the month of September, we turn 65 as a church, to look ahead and say, where might God be leading and what would it look like to serve Him in the particulars of where we are, 5, 10, 15 years down the road. And Deuteronomy is a good book, we said, to do that because it's at that kind of a point in Israel's history. Looking back, where has God been with us for 40 years as we wandered in the wilderness and had to figure out how to serve God in hard circumstances? And now where is God have us in the future? As we're about to enter into this new country, this new territory, and what does life look like there? And we said Deuteronomy kind of divides into some sections. The first 4 chapters or so just rehearse this history. This is what God has been doing for you up to this point. And then in chapters 5 through 11, there's sort of this general principle that is repeated over and over again in different forms, but it comes down to this. Wherever you go, don't forget the Lord. And then starting in chapter 12, Deuteronomy begins to apply that general principle. Don't forget God. And it applies it to the particulars of life in a new land. And so first of all, there's some chapters that say, this is how you don't forget God in your worship. And we looked at one of those, chapter 12, a few weeks back. And then it moves kind of from worship into community life. And we looked at a chapter last week that had a variety of just different, kind of random to us instructions, but some different instructions about what community life looks like. And we tried to get at what are some of the things, the principles that guide community life for us too, as we look to the future. And then starting in chapter 27, there's a new section of the book, and we're going to look at a representative chapter from that today. And this is a section of blessings and curses. And we got a little bit of a flavor for it with what Bob read earlier from the reading of the law. But basically, there's a ceremony, and it's starting in chapter 27, Moses says to the people of Israel, okay, you've heard all of this now. Now the challenge is up to you. Are you really intending to live as God's people? When you go into this new place, do you really want to be God's people? Because you have to remember that it's not just about checking off the boxes, but it's about relationship with God. And we're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 30, about that commitment to God and what that looks like today. Let's take a moment first to ask God's blessing on the reading of His Word. Heavenly Father, we praise You for giving us, poor sinners, as we sang just a minute ago, so vast a benefit, that we get to be in communion, in relationship with Your Son, Jesus Christ. And so, Lord, we ask that You would also give us the benefit this morning, that You would never allow us to forget the truth of the gospel, that we are saved from sin and shame and called to holiness. Rather, Lord, imprint it on our hearts through Your word today, so that we grow in faith, a faith committed to good works, and so that we direct our whole life to Your glory and to building up our neighbor through the work and the ministry of Jesus, Your Son, in whose name we pray. Amen. So Deuteronomy 30, beginning at verse 11. This is Moses speaking now to the people of Israel. Now, what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It's not up in heaven so that you have to ask, who's going to go up into heaven to get it for us and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It's in your mouth and in your heart so you may obey it. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to Him, and to keep His decrees, commands, and laws. And then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your hearts turn away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to His voice, and hold fast to Him. For the Lord is your life, and He will give you many years in the land He swore to give you your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, friends of Jesus, one of the things that has fascinated me about New England since we moved here, especially for me as a native of the Midwest, is the maritime history of this region. And one of the places we visited is Mystic Seaport Museum. And we visited this a few times since we moved to the Northeast. Actually, we'd visited already when we lived in New Jersey. And this past year, we decided that we would get a family membership to Mystic so we could go a few times. And so Mystic is kind of fresh in my mind this year. Now, if you've been to Mystic, you know that it's a living history museum that has, among other things, a collection of large wooden sailing ships, like the one here on the screen. One of them, Charles W. Morgan. In fact, one of the things that's unique about Mystic Seaport, it is one of the few shipyards in the world that has the tools and the techniques for traditional wooden shipbuilding. And one of the things I've learned, especially this last year, kind of reading at these things a little closer, is that wooden ships like the Morgan take a lot of work. Now, Charles Morgan is a whaling ship. Maybe some of you have been to Mystic, you know this. It's a wooden whaling ship built in the 1840s, brought to Mystic about 100 years later, but it wasn't really preserved until several decades after it had been on the property. And if you go through the museum there, you can read about the dangers to the hulls of wooden ships. And there's quite a few of them. Boards can just rot and crack. Or the caulking that goes in between them can dry out and give way and allow water to get through. Now the Morgan, I learned, didn't use any metal nails in it because metal nails rust, but some ships did, and they found out that that wasn't such a great idea. And one of the greatest dangers to wooden sailing ships is what they call shipworms. It's kind of a long, skinny barnacle that gets its mouthpieces on the wood, and it begins to bore a hole into the wood. And so if you aren't on top of this kind of thing, before you know it, you have a ship that looks intact, but the wood is full of holes. And when you think about all these dangers to wooden sailing ships, there's another picture here, it's really a wonder that these things stay afloat at all. Now this is another one they're working on, so it's not that it actually was in the water this way, but you can get a picture for how these things can begin to fall apart. It takes a lot of vigilance and effort to make sure that your boards in the ship are constantly being monitored for these dangers. And the only way to maintain a wooden ship at some point is to take it out of the water and to rebuild it little by little. A wooden ship takes constant vigilance. Now, as I thought of all of this, and you got these images now kind of in the back of your mind, as I thought about all of this, I had a conversation recently about Mystic and just the wonder that these ships actually float. It made me think about the project of keeping a church afloat. When I was growing up, there was a stained glass window, one of a series of stained glass windows in the church where I grew up, and one of them was the ship of the gospel, and I can still see that picture in my mind. This wooden ship with sails billowing out, kind of being blown across a tossed sea. Keeping a ship afloat, keeping a church afloat for any length of time takes effort. It doesn't take much challenge, I think, to see the dangers that are around us in New England, not just for this church, but for any church in New England in particular. About 10 years ago, I went to a pastor's conference where one of the statistics that was reported is that the median church size, so your typical church in Vermont, has about 30 adult members. Now, we aren't in Vermont, and we have a few more than 30 people here this morning. But the numbers in Massachusetts aren't significantly better, at least in terms of worship attendance. In fact, about half of residents in Massachusetts say that they never, ever attend a worship service. And that was the numbers taken in a poll right before COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it should be obvious to anyone who's looking at numbers like these that churches, and we as a church, are in a different era than we were a generation or two ago. And we have to recognize that we're no longer trying to call people back into church, because the people that we're talking to on the streets, our neighbors, our friends, our relatives, maybe sometimes even our relatives, don't have an experience of church or of Jesus to come back to. And so the mission of the church, the mission of the gospel in this new world is to introduce people once again to the wonder and the beauty of following Jesus and what it means to be called into relationship with him, and then to invite them and say, as Moses does to us this morning, isn't this what you would want to follow and be a part of? See, keeping the ship of God's people afloat has always been a challenging prospect in any culture. And as we said earlier about Deuteronomy, over the course of the previous several chapters, 27, 28, 29, Moses has offered the Israelites a picture of blessings inherent in following the Lord, but also a picture of the curses, the warnings about what happens when we fall away from the Lord. The things that can trip up and sink the ship. And we heard some of them this morning. Behaviors and attitudes that get into our hearts and make us people who no longer can be supported and floated, so to speak, on the waves of this world by God's Spirit. But as our confessions remind us, acknowledging our sin and misery also opens us to a renewed awareness of God's grace. And the first half of Deuteronomy 30 points us to that incredible mercy of God that brings back those who have sinned. Even if Israel found themselves, we read, in the most distant land under heaven, even if the ship's hull, so to speak, is riddled with holes and completely unseaworthy, God can restore. Now, sin's not a pleasant thing to talk about, but as Paul Tripp writes, it is only the person who is deeply aware of their sin who gets excited about grace. And it is only grace that can give you the courage to humbly face the enormity of your sin. And I think that's a good call for us as a church, to be a community that both is aware of our sin, so we can be excited about grace, so we can then have the courage to face whatever uncertainties and billowing seas that we come across in the years to come. Now, it's that awareness of both sin and grace that Israel and we are told by Moses will keep the ship of the gospel afloat as we look ahead to life in a new time and place. And so this morning, I want to pick up on just two words. If you're somebody who sometimes has challenges following, remembering what the sermon was about, this morning hopefully is the one that you want, because there's only two words to remember. The words are life and today. And I want to think about these two words and kind of the ideas that they represent as a kind of maintenance plan for a church, this church, as we look ahead to where God is bringing us in the years to come. Now, the first of these words I said is life. Choose life. And starting in verse 15, we find this word being used with increasing frequency over and over. Some concept of life or live. You are people who should live. And there's a contrast that faces Israel in their new place. You can choose life and prosperity, or you can choose death and destruction. It's a choice between life and death, blessings and curses. All the material of the previous chapters, 27, 28, 29, shows back up here in these verses. And we read it here, we felt it here even this morning, right? When I read it. But if you turn away from the Lord, here's what's going to happen. And Moses' instruction for the Israelites is quite simple. He says, if you want things to go well for you, choose life. Choose life. And choosing life, he makes clear, is not, first of all, sitting on the beach with your feet up, drinking a soda or whatever it is, whatever your favorite drink is, and munching on pretzels or cookies or whatever. No, choosing life involves loving the Lord and keeping his commands. In verse 17, Moses says it also involves a turning away, deliberate turning away from the worship of other gods, from other things that would undermine our relationship with the one true God. Choosing life involves setting some kind of deliberate direction to our stories and saying, this is what I want my life to be about. When it comes time for somebody to tell the story of my life, I want it to say, he or she was walking with God. This church was seeking to walk with God. That's a story that we want to be told. That there was a faithful Savior whose hold on this person was evident, whose hold on this church was clear. Body and soul, life and in death. See, choosing life is more than just staying in good medical shape or And proper worship is more than just getting rid of that statue of Zeus that, you had in the corner of your backyard, I'm sure. Blogger Janet Hunt describes it in terms of counting the cost. And she illustrates that idea with a news story that she ran across that took place in Brooklyn about 10 years ago. It's a story about two little kitty cats. Only these aren't like cute kitty cats that you'd keep at home. These are stray cats that wander around the streets of New York City and get stuck in subway lines. See, I think it was August of 2013, if you were a commuter on the Brooklyn subway line, there was a day in which you would have got to your train station in the afternoon and you would have found that the subway was shut down. And if you asked around, instead of, it's usually crowded in the afternoon, right? But if you would have asked around, so is there maintenance on the tracks? Is the train running late? Is there a problem? No, the problem is that there's two little stray cats stuck on the rails somewhere up ahead. And there's lots of talk in that setting about counting the cost. And Janet Hunt notes, she says, somebody up in the MTA, the transit authorities there, had to make a decision. Are the lives of these two stray cats worth the inconvenience and the cost of shutting down the subway for 90 minutes to try to catch them? Apparently it was kind of funny I didn't see the video, but she says it was kind of funny, the video, these MTA authorities trying to run around the subway tunnel catching these cats. And there was lots of pushback about how it was not a good choice. But she says everything in our lives has a value. And she compares it to the kinds of other decisions that you and I have to make every day. The decisions about what you do at school when the popular kids are saying, hey, let's do this, or let's talk this way, or let's act this way towards this other kid in class, and you have to decide if you are going to do that and go along with them so you can look popular, or if you can care about the kids around you or the way that you talk and how it reflects on God's character. Or a decision to structure lives and leisure so that worship and Christian community can be central and can be a focus point in our lives, and we have the opportunity then to worship with and build up people instead of kind of flitting in and out of their lives. Or a decision to pass on job or college path. Because that path, as much as it would bring maybe wealth and acclaim and honor, is something that would undermine our faith formation. And Janet Hunt thinks about some times in her own life where she had to make those kinds of decisions, and she says, was there a cost to it? Yes, there was, in reputation, in dollars. But it was the right thing to do because it was a way of choosing life. What is life? Well, Deuteronomy doesn't structure it saying it has to be this way forever. There's only a monarchy in Israel, or there's only these structures, your towns are set up this way. Deuteronomy envisions that for Israel, but it doesn't say it has to be this way forever. Rather, what Deuteronomy does is to call us to be seeking God's will in all circumstances. And the same is true with the ship of the church. I recently had a conversation with someone who grew up in the CRC and was talking about how here in town they were walking to catechism class because it met during the week back then. And they mentioned that you went past the movie theater in town, and just in passing they said, but of course no good Christian Reformed young person would go into the movie theater back then. And those of you who grew up Christian Reformed are kind of laughing because you're like, yeah, I know that, because there was a time and a place where worldly amusements were off limits. Now, as a church, we've decided in the last couple of generations that maybe movies weren't quite the threat to faith that we once thought they were. But that doesn't mean that our great-grandparents were wrong to warn against the spiritual dangers of secular entertainment. The principle is still the same, even if the application is different. The call is choose life. Another recent conversation, I was reminded that our culture right now is incredibly hesitant to invite people into our homes, but we welcome just about anyone and anything into our homes through those little screens on our devices. And this person was suggesting, in the spirit of Deuteronomy, not even knowing that I was preaching on it this month, was just suggesting in the spirit of Deuteronomy, what if we thought about those little edges of our screens as the door frames of our houses and our gates? The door frames of Deuteronomy says we have to write the commands of the Lord our God so that when we go out and when we come in, we remember that life is framed that way. What if on our devices, whatever is streaming in to us on YouTube or on TikTok or whatever service you're using that day, that we're aware of the ways that it's influencing our thinking about materialism or sexuality or the value of worship and community? What if we framed everything coming through that screen, through the commands and the call to serve the Lord? Don't forget the Lord as you're watching this content come in. And we can do the same thing as a church, right? Not necessarily with the screens here, but with the kind of content that comes in from the world and the decisions that we make as a result. Because there's always a temptation as a church to go along with what the world says, to let the values of the world or to let the way of the world's activity shape what we do. And to do it out of a genuine desire, a good desire to engage the world around us, but to forget in that process that it needs to be framed. We need to have the lens around it of God's commands. Don't forget the Lord. And Moses invites us over and over, choose life. In the little things, in the little decisions that you make day by day, at school, at home, at work, in the meetings that you have about church, choose life. The Lord is your life. Be intentional about your relationship with God. Attend to His Word. It's an essential part of the maintenance plan of the church. Life. Life in the Lord. But there's a second word that begins to occur with increasing frequency too throughout these verses that we read this morning, and it's the word today. And I think this word is noteworthy because it gives you a sense of the urgency. If I've got that great big wooden sailing ship and I'm not thinking for 5 or 10 years about what's underneath in the hull and I never get it out of the water to take a look, sooner or later that ship is going to be so far gone that I'm not going to be able to do anything with it. It's going to start falling apart underneath me. And the same thing is true with the church. Now Moses, interestingly, is challenging the generation in front of him. He's obviously aware that the people in front of him are those who have been wandering in the wilderness and are about to enter the promised land. But throughout Deuteronomy, he has a kind of a strange way of thinking in some ways, because he's saying at one point, he says, yes, and it wasn't just with the people who were at Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, that God made his covenant, but it was with us here today. You're thinking to yourself, well, wait a second, I wasn't there 38 years ago. I'm only 36 years old. How can God be making a covenant with me? And then you get to a chapter like this one, and we heard it in the first half of this chapter, and Moses says, when you're off in exile somewhere and you're thinking again, wait a second, God is sending us into the promised land. We're in there to kind of take over and complete this conquest. What are we talking about exile? But Moses has kind of this whole picture of the Christian life, this whole picture of the generations of the Christian faith, the people of God, in view as he gives his instructions here this morning. There's no sense that once Israel completes the conquest and settles in, things will be able to just run themselves. And I think sometimes we do that in the church. We always kind of look back, and everybody who thinks the generation before them or whatever was, you get to about 50 years old and you think, weren't things great 50 years ago? But I think we all realize that just because the church got to where we were in 1950 or 1960 doesn't mean that now we were on just set it on cruise control and here we are today. That doesn't work. We need to constantly ask ourselves, what does God's word to us, what does life with God mean now, today? Not because God's word changes, not because Jesus Christ is any different today or tomorrow than he was yesterday, but because God's grace, God's life always comes into different specific situations. I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And I'm not the same person I will be in 5 or 10 years from now. The same is true of this church. We're not the same that we were 20 years ago. And we're not the same as God's going to have us be 5 or 10 years from now. Yesterday's challenge for Israel might have been competing with those hostile pagan nations that were trying to undermine their faith as they were making life in a new place. But a generation or two from then, the challenge is going to be different. The challenge is going to be fighting against the complacency that comes from material comfort and not having those enemies at the door all the time. Both are spiritually deadly. But the gospel application might vary just as treatments for different medical conditions vary. And so what Moses is saying in this covenant renewal ceremony is we need to constantly be thinking about what does God's law, what does God's life look like for us today? And Moses says, it's not rocket science. I'm paraphrasing. He didn't actually say that in verses 10 and 11 and so forth, but that's what he meant. It's not a mystery. You don't have to figure out, I don't know, God didn't mention computers, so what in the world could we be doing with that today? No, he says the principles, the relationship with God is always there. The word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so you can obey it. It all comes down to this. Keep seeking the Lord. Keep the story of his grace in front of you. Remember the deliverance that he gave for you and bringing you out of Egypt. Remembering what he's done for you in saving you from sin. Be aware of your own sins so that you can be aware of his mercy. Paul later quotes these words from Deuteronomy in Romans 10. And to point to the importance of an ongoing confession of Jesus as Lord. In other words, he says the church needs to keep saying that it believes Jesus, that it understands what it means to be saved from sin and set free for service to him. And the concept of today reminds us that profession of faith in Christ is not a one-time thing. A young person who stood up here as a teenager and said that they believed Jesus was their Savior, but who hasn't been in a church in 10 years since they went to college, and whose language and lifestyle choices are no different than those in Hollywood movies, that person is not living for Jesus today. And in some ways, the gap between church and culture in a place like New England may help us remember more clearly that there's a call that we make to intentionally serve Jesus day by day. And that doesn't mean that our neighbors are horrible people. A lot of our neighbors are wonderful people. But it's not about the behavior, it is about the relationship with God that drives the behavior. For churches that have been around for any length of time, that means we may need to be willing to acknowledge that historic relationship to a congregation is not what binds us together. Our ministry as a church is rooted in a common ongoing relationship with Jesus and in obedience to him day by day. A sense that we want to be following this Lord and this Savior with all that we are. And that can be difficult because there's lots of other things that can connect people too. Family ties, relationships from school, similar hobbies and interests, maybe a love for the music or the ministry of the church. But all of that stuff is secondary to a commitment to Jesus. And one of the greatest things that a church can do, not just its leaders, but its people, is to remind one another, this is why we are here. We are here because we are following Jesus. Because we need his grace, because we need his forgiveness, because we need his instruction to give us a way forward. And we need to make that decision to follow him again and again and again in the little things of life. Because he first loved us. Life today. Two simple words. Two simple words that can make a maintenance plan for our lives and for Christian community. Now, I started with a story about the Charles Morgan at Mystic. For the first 30 years or so that this ship was at the Mystic Seaport Museum, it wasn't even floating. Maybe some of you have been to Mystic and you know this. They looked at that ship and they said, this thing is almost 100 years old. It's not really going to last very long if we try to keep it floating. It's going to take a lot of work. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a bunch of sand underneath it next to the pier where we're going to tie it up. And we're going to intentionally run it aground on that pier. And it worked. For 30 years, nothing moved that ship. And thousands of people came and visited it. But the museum folks looked at it and said, there's something wrong with this thing. It's going to fall apart sooner or later. Just because we got it stuck here in the sand doesn't mean that it's safe forever. And so they pulled it out of the water and they began a restoration plan and they could float it. And then Just a couple years ago, about 10 years ago, they took it out again, and they did another restoration on it. I got a picture of it after that restoration. Here it is today. Well, here it is in 2014. And as you can see, it's out there. It's on the water. Making a voyage, this is part of its test run, but it made a voyage where it went to all of its historic ports along southern New England. The Morgan, as a result of the maintenance that they've done to that ship, is now the second oldest wooden sailing ship in the world that it's seaworthy. After the other one that is seaworthy, not too far from us, which you may know, the USS Constitution. That maintenance plan took a lot of dedication. It took taking it out of the water and painstakingly looking at it board by board, little decision after little decision. It took an investment of finances and time. But we have a ship that can sail. And the promise of the gospel is that the same can be true of the church. God calls us to look at our lives little by little and to choose over and over again in decisions for Him life. Choose relationship with God. Recognize the covenant which He reaches out to us. And then make that decision over and over today. Because the Lord is our life. When we turn to Him, we find that He's already seeking us. He's enabling us to hear Him, love Him, honor Him, glorify Him, serve Him. The one thing, the only thing that gives life to a church is its Lord Jesus, who pours His Spirit upon us. And our response is to seek His life and to cultivate that life today. And when we do, we may have confidence that whatever else happens in the years to come, the Lord will keep the ship of His church afloat. Let's pray.